I'll try to get all this in on one slide. We'll do our best here. When we talk about Anne Bradstreet, we're talking about somebody who was born in England, 1612, educated in England, and then made the trip over as part of that first generation of Puritans to come to New England, specifically the Massachusetts Bay Colony. She lived only to be 60, but she left a tremendous and very good body of poetry behind. Want to speak for a moment about her childhood and sometimes we talk about the 17th century. We talk about 17th century writers like John Donne and John Milton and whatnot, and we forget that the early part of the 17th century was still part of the Renaissance. Even the latter part of the 17th century was not yet the Enlightenment. So when we talk about Anne Bradstreet being born in 1612, this is someone who was born during the time of Shakespeare. So she was part of that culture. She was very much a Renaissance young woman anyway, and so she's part of that first generation. One of the things that's kind of curious, her father was sort of the estate manager, if you will, for the Earl of Lincoln, her father Thomas Dudley. Now, that had a lot of advantages. First of all, when you managed a major estate for a major aristocrat like the Earl of Lincoln, that was a big job. I mean, that was kind of like being CEO of that guy's company. You managed the whole house. You had to be very, very educated. You had to be very good on your toes. This is not like being a butler someplace. This guy managed the whole property for him, as best we can tell. And that meant that his daughter grew up on the Earl's estate and evidently, and quite obviously, had access to the Earl's library, which would have been very, very substantial. So as a girl growing up, she would have had opportunities that most middle class even, or even many upper class girls would not have had, to read the classic works of literature, philosophy, theology, all of those sorts of things. And there's no question that she had a tremendous background in literature. She clearly had read Ben Jonson and probably some Shakespeare, probably Marlowe and others, certainly the Sonneteers, and so on, because you can see in her works the influence of some of these, particularly Ben Jonson. She must have been very, very fond of Ben Jonson, as we'll talk about here in a little bit. Well, the story goes anyway, and everybody's entitled to their own opinion, even me. All right, so I'm going to give you mine. The story goes that she wrote a set of poems, extensive set of poems, evidently shared them with family members and friends and so on. And unbeknownst to her, allegedly, her brother-in-law, John Woodbridge, decided to kidnap these poems, bring them over to London, and publish them against her will or without her knowledge or consent and so on, and gave it the title, The 10th Muse Lately Sprung Up in America, right? Because there are 9 muses in classical mythology and different muses for dance and history and poetry, etc. But this is the 10th muse. She's the newest muse, right? So that's the sort of the play on the title there. Well, all right, you can believe what you want to. I happen to think it's quite convenient that her brother-in-law does this, and she's able to claim that she didn't know anything about it, or at least she feigns innocence. I don't say that she lies about it, but she would have you believe that this was something that was done all because of her brother-in-law's design. I don't know about that. I wonder whether it isn't, a convenient way of saying, look, I wouldn't have published this. I'm not that vain. I don't think that much of myself. As a woman, I really have the man took off with my poems. What am I supposed to do about it, right? The reason I bring that up, because the prologue to what is generally regarded the second edition, the prologue of 10th Muse is a fascinating poem in itself, because as the first poem to lead off in the second edition, really, of these poems, it makes a sort of apology for the book, and that's kind of a standard practice. Oh, my poetry is not very good. Sorry, it's not that great. I wish I were better, but I'm not. Please, if you deign to read this, don't make fun of me, etc., etc. That's kind of de jure, okay? I'm sorry, I'm going to say de rigueur. And it's expected that a writer would apologize for her or his work at the beginning. But I want you to look at how this thing is put together, okay? Let's look at the first stanza. To sing of wars, of captains and of kings, of cities founded, commonwealths begun, for my mean pen are 2 superior things. Or how they all or each their dates have run, let poets and historians set these forth. My obscure lines shall not so dim their worth. right? In other words, I'm not going to write an epic. I'm not writing history. I'm not good enough to write that. I'm no Homer, right? I'm no Ovid. I can't do that. I'm not an epic poet. I can't do that. No, no, no. This I'm not claiming to do any of that kind of thing. Notice as we go along all the different classical references. That marks it as being very Renaissance. The Renaissance wasn't shy at all about using classical references. They weren't worried about those old pagan Greek and Romans at all. As a matter of fact, it was a great way of being able to show off what you knew. Okay, so you get all this stuff about Calliope, and you get all this stuff about the Greeks and the sugar-tongued, the sweet-tongued Greeks, and so on. My foolish, broken, blemished muse so sings, and this to mend, alas, no art is able, 'cause nature made it so irreparable. Right? Isn't that a horrible rhyme? It's an intentional horrible rhyme in my view, in stanza 3. Able and irreparable, right? That's terrible. And she does it, I think, on purpose, right? Because she's talking in that stanza about, oh, I'm not a very good poet, see, and I even know it, see, right? So it's kind of a corny-ish kind of thing. But where it gets interesting is in stanzas 5, 6, and 7. And a lot of attention has been paid to these because some people have argued that this is some sort of feminist manifesto. Well, you make your own conclusions. It certainly seems that she's saying something that your average, I guess, Puritan middle-class woman might be at least hesitant to argue. She's making a good case. What I think people overlook in this is the powerful rhetorical argument that's offered here. She says in stanza 5, I am obnoxious to each carping tongue who says my hand a needle better fits. Right? These are the people who are kind of criticizing her. You're a woman. You shouldn't pick up a pen. You should pick up some knitting needles. Right? A poet's pen all scorn I should thus wrong. For such despite they cast on female wits. People think, women can't write poetry. If what I do prove well, it won't advance. They'll say it's stolen, or else it was by chance. In other words, she puts in stanza 5 a really interesting argument. If I'm a female and I write poetry, I'm in a no-win situation. Because if I write bad poetry, people will say, see, women can't write poetry. But if what I do prove well, if I'm writing good poetry, it doesn't matter. Because they'll say, she stole it, or it was by luck. She lucked out and wrote a good poem. Anybody writes 1,000 poems, one of them's going to be good. Right? So she sets up this wonderful argument that is from a woman's perspective, obviously, that, hey, I'm not here to write something wonderfully profound. I'm not here to outdo Homer. I'm just here to present you with my poetry as it is, and I hope that you'll enjoy it. Now, if you say women can't write poetry, then what are you wasting your time for? If you say that women can write poetry, and occasionally it's good, but it's only because they steal it, well, then I'm in a no-win, I'm in a lose-lose situation. But anyway, I persevere. Stanza 6. But sure, meaning surely, the antique Greeks were far more mild, else of our sex why feigned they those 9? In other words, hey, you know what? Even the Greeks were nicer to women than Christians are. And we're supposed to know better. Even the antique Greeks were far more mild, else of our sex, why feigned they those 9? The muses were all female. They were the ones that inspired people to write, right? We should be better than that. And poesy made Calliope's own child. Calliope is the muse of poetry. So amongst the rest they placed the arts divine. But this week not, argument, they will full soon untie. The Greeks did naught but play the fools and lie, right? Oh, you can't even cite the Greeks to them, because then they'll say, well, they were idiots, they were pagans, then they lied a lot, right? They were a barbaric, backward civilization. But notice what the argument is. Well, if they are, they certainly were ahead of us in this one regard, and that is that they were at least more, they recognized women's abilities in the arts more than we do. Don't you think we should be even more charitable towards the so-called fair sex? It's quite an interesting little argument she's making. Stanza 7, she basically says, never mind, don't worry about that. Let Greeks be Greeks and women what they are. Men have precedency and still excel. It is but vain unjustly to wage war. Men can do best and women know it well. Preeminence in all and each is yours, yet grant some small acknowledgement of ours. Now, this is the stanza that makes people divide sides, right? Is she saying, look, men are better poets, I know it. They're better intellectuals, I know it. They can do better at the arts than women, I know it. But, that doesn't mean we can't write good stuff too, and maybe we won't ever be as good as you, but there are a lot of people who read this and say, I happen to think that she's a little bit more clever than that. And this is a very sort of veiled argument, which in essence says, oh, you guys are so much smarter than we are. I know you are. You're really, really smart. You're so much better, and you're so much, you write better poetry, and you're so brilliant and everything. And that being the case, why are you the least bit threatened by my poetry? I mean, if you're really that superior as a gender, you shouldn't mind, frankly, unless you're threatened for some reason that you've not mentioned, right? I happen to think the latter. I happen to think Bradstreet is so clever with her argument here that what she's done is she's chopped the legs off of her opponent by saying, look, number one, if you as a man think that women's poetry is so inferior, why would you even bother to criticize mine? I mean, if you're that darn good, you don't go around critiquing inferior poetry anyway, unless you feel threatened by it. And you surely couldn't feel threatened unless there was some reason for you to believe that maybe I might be as good a poet as you, right? It's a really clever little twisted argument. Twisted, I don't mean twisted as in, disturbing, but a sort of clever twist on an argument there that I think many people have overlooked. It's a very sophisticated rhetorical argument. The whole thing is an argument, and it's well wrought, in my opinion.